Hey everyone, welcome to Youth Speaks' first poetry and politics conversation. I'm so happy you're here. Happy Wednesday, everybody. Thank you for joining us during your lunch. I hope you have a cup of water. I hope you have your tea, your coffee. Hopefully you're somewhere able to just enjoy the conversation that we're about to have in the next hour. My name is Michelle Mushley, and I'm happy to introduce myself as the new executive director at Youth Speaks. I am so honored to be in conversation today with my good friend of over 15 years. I want to say at least 15 years. There's old pictures of us at Brave New Voices, the International Youth Poetry Slam Festival back in the day. So it's just an honor to be here with Terry Taplin. I got to give Terry a real quick intro, but before that, since this is the inaugural conversation, we're going to be having conversations like this throughout the year. The idea here is to highlight some of the incredible alumni that have come through Youth Speaks over the last 25 years of us being together. So we hope to engage thought partners, cultural leaders, leaders in the country and in the global movement for change who are working through the arts and culture, but even expanding the notion of what's possible when poets and artists apply their voices, their creativity, and their belief in deep community, a beloved community for social justice and impact. So without further ado, welcome. And I'm going to give you Terry's formal bio because yes, Terry's my good friend, and there's just so much more. So without further ado, I'm honored to introduce everybody on today's chat to Terry Taplin, who is a poet, a Youth Speaks alumni, and the youngest Berkeley City Council member representing District 2, West and Southwest Berkeley. Shout out Southwest Berkeley, shout out West Berkeley. A mobility and environmental justice activist, Terry has led on housing, green transportation, and fights for climate resilient futures. As a West Berkeley native, Terry envisions a future where West Berkeley is at the center of an economically vibrant, innovative, and sustainable East Bay. Without that, please show all the love to my friend, poet, City Council extraordinaire, Mr. Terry Taplin.
Hello, hey Mush, thank you so much. Hey everybody. Just real quick, I'm actually the second youngest on the council, but hey, I will take being the youngest. I will be the youngest, so I'll take it.
Noted. You are the second youngest council member on Berkeley City Council. Terry, how long has it been now since you've stepped into this role on City Council?
It's been like a year and a half. I was elected in the November 2020 elections, and it's just been kind of one like epic battle after the next. But it's felt like I've been here for a lot longer. But I have to sort of stop and think, oh no, it's only been a year and a half. I can probably slow down and chill out a little bit.
That's incredible. And I'm not going to ask your age, although I already know it, but just know that Terry Taplin Terry, how old were you when you first came into Youth Speaks? I must have been in my early 20s. So you were like 9?
I was like, I'm just joking. I was like 14, 15. Yeah, I used to sneak out to go see the semifinals at La Peña.
Oh my God. We used to have poetry slams at La Peña Cultural Center in Berkeley. Shout out La Peña. And Terry was a student at Berkeley High School. And so how did you sneak out? This is not even unscripted.
Well, I was like, I think because there would be like 2 nights back to back.
Yeah.
The first night, my godmother took me. And then the second night, I just figured out how to get back there. And I just went through the back door and just, but I got caught. My mom came and got me.
Your mom came and got you. Usually you hear stories about kids going to prom without permission and then their moms or dads or somebody coming in and pulling them out. But for Terry Taplin, y'all, for Councilmember Taplin, it was his mom pulling him out of La Peña. So you heard it here first. This is no questions here will be incriminating. We are all love and joy and poetry here. Terry, we got a couple questions. This is meant to be just a conversation. I've been really curious. I've had my stint in working in the city of Oakland And I'm curious to know, I mean, we'll get into like the intersection of politics, government and civic life and creativity, but I want to know, because I remember this, like for the folks who are tuning in, what made you go from being in an MFA program, teaching creative writing with some friends that we know, San Francisco Poet Laureate. How did you make that leap from poetry and writing and the literary world and the academic space into city government? Almost like overnight. It wasn't overnight. It was a long fight, but how did you get there? What was happening in your life? What inspired you to make that move?
Well, I mean, it's a long story, but at that time, the end of my MFA program, I found myself, like I went through a lot and just in my life in that program, and I had gone through a lot, just like dealing with my partner, I losing her housing, dealing with my mom's, her health issues, and being displaced, and coming back to Berkeley and being, me and my grad program, my partner in his nursing program, trying to figure all that stuff out. And in the program, I think as many English departments across the country were having their moments to consider, how to really show up for equity and inclusion beyond, putting me on all the flyers at the Thanksgiving fundraising. How to really, embody that in the classroom, on campus, and I don't want to like go through all the details, but I was trying to, create a restorative justice process for this, kind of intense microaggression that took place between some of the students and some of our guest faculty. And like, it was in the midst of all this, all the talk about equity and inclusion. I was like, okay, well, if that's where we are, then we're gonna, address what happened and we can create this process for accountability. And I got like so much pushback. And I was going through all these hoops, and then all that together, I was like, look, all right, if I'm going through all these like procedural bureaucratic battles, trying to like, actually make equity and inclusion like a real thing for folks, so folks can like, so I don't have to be the only like gay Black person in the room or the only Black person in the room, so I don't have to be like 1/3 of the diversity for the program. So folks can see themselves in these spaces, St. Mary's is a great college, the program is great, but these are spaces that are very exclusive and that are very hard to access because you do have to sort of go through all these things. And I was back home with my mom. I was seeing her with her health struggles, and I felt like, all right, if I'm still around, I'm still in Berkeley, I want to step up for my mom, I want to step up for my neighborhood, because I was realizing a lot of folks who grew up here and are still here are like raising children or caring for elders, right? Yeah. And it's because no one can, there's no one can, like housing is like so inaccessible. And so we're all like living intergenerationally. But even that is difficult too, because there are all these barriers. Like if you're trying to like, expand your home to accommodate, a relative moving back, or, your family expanding, you have to like fight all like 80 of your neighbors and show up for meetings and, yell back and forth all night. And that is just like, that's just not like, that's not inclusive. That's not equitable. And so that's really what pushed me was over the edge, was like how real all those things got in my life. Housing precarity, health inequity. And like, it wasn't theoretical. I was living it. And, I did have to sacrifice, doing a PhD in medieval studies and running away to Italy. But I felt like
what?
that was plan A. This is plan B. But like, I felt like I had to, like, I grew up here. I survived because of, the strong women leaders in my life, my mom, my grandma, my teachers, and I'm seeing, everybody disappear or fight to stay. And I feel like I'm still here. So I have to like join that fight,
It's so profound to me. So there are parts of that story that I know really well, Terry, because I was there with you. We were having lunch when you told me that you're going to launch your candidacy and that you're going to file your paperwork to run for city council. And there are parts of the story that I didn't realize were happening. And it's so in many ways, it's such a reflection of Youth Speaks, like the way that we engage young people. And I know that you started when you were 14 and 15, but you also ended up leading our youth advisory program. Like you were leading spokes, and you then became like a peer and a young adult mentor, stewarding young people who are just coming in, who are also 13, 14, 15, and kind of finding their own voice, whether it was creatively or in other platforms, whether it's in the courtroom or whether it's in front of City Hall, or whether it's in just, parent teacher conference with their, families. The thing that's really interesting about your story is you said that you were kind of pursuing something academically, professionally, but then when you came back home, there was also like an impetus to act as well. So these two things, kind of your professional, scholarly, and your personal life coming together. I'm curious, and maybe I'm drawing the connection, but I'm curious if you think that there's any kind of part of the pedagogy or the way that Youth Speaks kind of thinks about voice and youth development, that and the way that we introduce young people to writing and the power of their voice. Is there any of that that lives in you still?
Oh, absolutely. I think like the big thing being, speaking truth to power, creating that space for the next generation to speak for itself, taking ownership of one's experience and identity and articulating that, and across difference with cultural competency and sensitivity. And just like, leading from the ground up, foregrounding folks with lived experience. I feel like that's like what Youth Speaks was for me. That's where I learned all these things, I'll try to say this politely, but Berkeley is a place where we're known for, all these movements, and some people come here for that, and they don't realize that there are folks here who, have been steeped in that this whole time. And in Youth Speaks, I learned how to understand my own privilege and how that impacts how I move through spaces. The same for others, and how to kind of like, both persist through that difficulty, but also like hold each other accountable for being their selves, so that we can kind of like, instead of like competing for who's going to get, the grant from the white people, we're going to like actually create our own spaces where we don't have to like compete, where we can collaborate, where we can cultivate, rather than, relying on models that don't serve people who look like us or come where we come from.
That's such an interesting, it's a reality that if you're from the Bay Area, and specifically for you, Terry, if you're born and raised in South Berkeley, there is that contradiction of culture and social kind of states of being within a city. It's like, oh, Berkeley is like the mecca for activists and movements across history. And yet there are so many stories of systemic injustice, racial injustice, environmental, housing injustice that all intersect, and we can see them pretty clearly. If we look, right, if we look to the right places, if we're asking the right neighbors, we know that these things are still persisting. I'm wondering if you've seen any changes to the story of Berkeley in your time. Again, I won't share your age unless you'd like to, but has there been any cultural shifts in the way that Berkeley understands itself and their role as responsible for leading almost racial justice movements across the country? Because it is such, we read about Mario Savio, we read about the free speech movement, we read about the third world liberation movement. Has there been a shift or change at all? Are you seeing that with either younger populace in Berkeley or younger activists from where you sit? Can you tell us like how is the kind of the identity of Berkeley shifted, if at all?
Very much so. Definitely having, more younger folks getting involved, both folks coming from campus, and also, younger people moving to Berkeley for, to build lives, or also people coming back too, young folks coming back. One of the things we've been able to do in housing discourse is to look at Berkeley's own history of racial exclusion and segregation, looking at like, old neighborhoods and how they were designed to keep out certain communities. And on council, we really have pushed the foreground that as we're trying to rethink how do we, because we have all the cities in California have to do something called a housing element. It's an amendment to the city's general plan that occurs every 10 years.
Wait, so I have to back you up real quick, Terry. For folks who may not, you just said a lot of words. Like amendment, you said general plan, and I know what a general plan is, but for most folks, like this is also an opportunity for anyone who's like a young person or is an alumni of You Speaks or is just interested in poetry and culture and storytelling that has ambitions to apply that elsewhere outside of the theater or as beyond the arts and culture field. Like what are the things that you just said? What is the general plan and why does it matter for folks to know what that is? Like, what is that real quick? Give us a kind of this is also civics 101, because we don't do that anymore, apparently, in California public schools. No shade.
No, that's a great question. So a general plan is something the city has to write that guides how the city will grow and change over time. And we look at, okay, this is the downtown. What kind of businesses are here? What kind of housing is here? How are people moving through this part of town? How does it connect to this part of town? And there's one of those for each area. So my area, there's a West Berkeley plan, there's a San Pablo Avenue area specific plan, there's a Berkeley Marina area specific plan. And we try to zoom out, okay, 30 years from now, what do we want it to look like and how do we get there? And that's kind of, and all those together is the, more or less the general plan for the city's long-term trajectory. The housing element is a part of the plan that addresses how we will accommodate housing growth population across income levels throughout the city of Berkeley. So while we're doing that now, we decided to, okay, if we're doing the housing element, we're going to address our own legacy of housing injustice. At the same time, we also have a legacy for fair housing. Byron Rumford, who was a Berkeley man, first, African-American assembly member. He was a pharmacist. He did like fair housing legislation. And these are all things that I didn't learn any of that in, even in Berkeley schools, nothing against, whatever, but that just didn't come up. And because one of the things I really admire about living intergenerationally is that younger folks who grew up with different tools, so information and research for us is a lot easier and more nimble. So it's easy for someone to look through an archive, do a Twitter thread that gets shared, and it's easy to share what folks are doing in programs or whatever. And we have folks who are still here who have that institutional knowledge and lived memory, and allowing both those two streams to feed into the discourse, we've been able to really move people and challenge folks in ways that I don't think would have been possible until now, especially about racial justice in Berkeley, because obviously, everyone in Berkeley is so amazing and perfect. We have no biases because how could we, right? And it's hard to sit there and be like, oh, my neighborhood looks this way because someone decided to make it so that only this kind of family could live here. That's hard for people to hear, right? It's hard to, and I think it's true of a lot of our history as a city too. We occupy a lonely land. We have a lot of nurseries rather in Berkeley, and a lot of these nurseries were owned by Japanese American families, that were just taken into the internment camps, right? So we have all these histories below the surface that that aren't always taught to us, but that are always there. And the more young folk, the more crosstalk that we have, the more visible and audible all these histories become.
I love that. And it's almost a perfect segue. They're as you're talking, there's so many questions that are coming up. I'm just going to put them out because we don't have the time to answer them all. But, housing and housing affordability and the housing crisis is also a big topic across the country, but certainly here in Oakland. So I serve on the Cultural Affairs Commission for the city of Oakland. And a lot of times, and I think, a lot of times there's this misperception that artists, cultural activists, cultural leaders, and even the creative economy, so small business owners that are rooted in culture and creation of, goods that are sustainable, that affect social impact and local communities, like that we don't have the analysis to be in those conversations. And so I think what you just named is that actually part of our lack of analysis or half analysis, oftentimes when it comes to issues like healthcare, education, even redistricting, those types of things, a lot of those, part of that is just, people will say, oh, it's a lack of education or a lack of proper kind of investment in the schooling system and all of that. But I think it's also tied to a lack of full narratives about what the whole story really is when it comes to equity, and the ways that we kind of come together as a city, as a municipality, as a community, as a neighborhood. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, which is my next question, which is, what is the power in your opinion? Tara, you're a writer. You're always going to be a writer. I know this about you. After your 9 to 5, after the subcommittee meetings are over, after the notes have been approved and things have been agendized, you always will be a writer. How do you see kind of narratives, youth-led narratives, or just narratives at large, intergenerational stories, impacting civic life, which is kind of a big question, but like, what is the role of stories, and particularly stories of communities of color, refugee, undocumented communities, in helping elevate what the priorities a city should understand, the priorities that, city government and electeds need to know and understand about how to govern, and the best practices and policies that should be implemented if equity, belonging, inclusion, racial justice, environmental justice, housing justice are true goals.
Okay, that's a great question. You might have to stop me here and there because
I know. Just like the power of stories in informing and shaping actually public policy versus it being handed down to the people, and then we react and either push back against it because we feel like it's unjust, or it perpetuates or maintains these systems of oppression and inequity. Like, just how do we elevate more stories, and also, like, as you listen to stories, city council, there's public comment all the time,
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
there
certainly is. That's part 2, public comment.
Poetry and public comments, with the focus on the public comments portion of every city council meeting.
Absolutely. I mean, starting with, the power and the question of language, kind of going back to, becoming a council member from being a poet, thinking about, what is the power of language? To what extent is language material? And how does language not only inform, but influence and, control or liberate our lived experience, right? Make no mistake, a parking ticket came from a section of the code that is language that lives on the books and on the road, like when you cross the street, when you even the kind of building your house can be made of, these are all laws. These are all language. These are language becoming real, concrete. And when the laws are, from law comes enforcement, comes the courts, comes policy, and it's all a big loop. And we know the city is empowered by its charter, a living document. Our constitution is, as a state, as a nation, these are all written documents. These are all language. And language can exclude, it can obscure, it can fuddle, it can deceive, all that. And if there, like, the more of us people who use language for truth become involved in the spaces where this kind of language is being created, I think ultimately that is for the greater good, and that is how we get to a better world, because we have the vision of the better world in our minds, and we have to confront the world we live in on the ground, and that space between very much is language. And this is like one extent of that is law, is policy and law. Looking at how stories, so one thing I deal with, because my district, Southwest Berkeley, we're in between, I-80, University exit, Ashby exit, we got San Pablo, everyone's speeding, no one wants to sit in traffic, people have been driving crazy through COVID, but we also have like a lot of parks and elementary schools and preschools and small houses together and senior homes and stuff. And that's one of the things I deal with a lot is people's speeding concerns or traffic concerns. And when we try to put in traffic calming improvements, things like, to kind of help the traffic not, prevent curtail speeding or increase, the ability for pedestrians and cyclists to cross, there are so many hoops we have to jump through because, it's the neighbors saying, hey, look, I don't want my pet to get run over, or I've been run over, or, people are speeding during pickup time. Like that we take those stories, we advocate, I do items asking for things we put in, but then we have the engineer saying, oh, well, not enough people have been hit here, like people aren't going fast enough, like we're not really going to do that. And then there's no way to like go to the neighbors and say, hey, they're not going to do it because not enough people have been hit, right? But I think that's wrong. I think that's backwards, because I don't care. Like, look, I like data. I like all that stuff. It doesn't mean anything to me because it's my job to listen to my constituents and take their stories and fight for what they need, because they're the ones on the ground almost getting hit. And I don't care what kind of spreadsheet you're using. That your job is you may be an engineer, but you still work for the city. And we have the same job, which is to protect our residents and advocate for their needs and provide critical resources, especially here in a historically Black and brown working class neighborhood that has suffered from decades and decades of disinvestment. We have the worst streets. We live on like toxic soil. We have factories polluting us. We have asthma rates. And now we're getting, aggressively gentrified. That's something that didn't just start, it started way before people want to talk about, but we don't have to go there right now. But like at the same time, my district is a significant part of the tax base now because of the commercial and manufacturing businesses and the new homeowners, and so this is how language and power become relational, because like on the one hand, yes, I have OGs and new residents on the same page, same issues. We all want the same things, but why is everyone feeling like this is the first time they've had a voice? And it's like, yeah, because I'm on council and I'm very vocal, but we should have been feeling like we had a voice this whole time because we're part of the city too, right? And so that's where, that's really where being a poet, coming through You Speaks, having that organizer experience really comes in hand, because I'm able to like mobilize the neighborhoods, make sure people come out and they give their testimony. And I use that because I'm like, look, see, this is where I'm coming from. These are my folks. These are our needs, and I'm not going to budge. I'm not going to, be shy about what I'm advocating for, because I grew up here. I saw us being ignored, and I've had it, and with language too comes like privilege, because I like code switching is real. People take me more seriously because I wear a suit. People like that I'm a poet, but if I wasn't a poet and had an MFA and studied ancient Greek and Latin, I would not be the glorious poet that they, I would be the glorious poet that I am. But
yes, you would.
But these some of these folks wouldn't be taking me so seriously,
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, the idea of like, we have to wear the language that gives us access to the door. And sometimes language is material, like in the form of physical attire and dress. And sometimes it's like social cues. I wonder, like, as it makes me think of kind of the part of, so Youth Speaks has been around for 25 years, and, it's beloved in many ways from, Brave New Voices, which was featured on HBO, and for all the folks who tune into YouTube, and the Teen Poetry Slam, which is our flagship event for 25 years. We've brought in thousands of Bay Area audiences to celebrate the voices of young people. It's been so much about the sound of voice, which we love. And, as a young person, I remember, especially as an Asian American woman growing up in the Bay Area, born in San Francisco, spent a lot of time in Oakland because my parents had small businesses here. I was always a little rebellious, kind of naturally, but to love the sound of my voice was really hard. And I feel like that's something that we teach young people to discover on their own. But the other part is about the skill required to truly listen, which is an active part of our model, which often doesn't get, we see the 2-hour show on the stage and we hear the applause of thousands of people in the audience. But what happens and precedes that is this deep, deep exercise, sustained exercise over the 9 months prior to that stage performance of active listening to the peers next to you to your left and right in the workshop space. Can you tell us a little bit about what is the role of chosen silence and listening for the poet who is also a public servant? Look, y'all, I made him think. It's a pause. That's a good question.
I mean, that's very real, because you're doing tournaments, you said you're hearing hundreds, thousands of poems. You're receiving those narratives, you're feeling that energy. You're getting deep insights. It's beautiful, it's powerful, it's challenging, it's humbling, and that's what it's like. That's what it's like in public comment. That's what it's like going out and talking to the community, because people aren't used to being heard. They're not used to speaking, and so when people come to you, especially in moments of vulnerability or trauma, you get everything. Everything they're in right now, that's being shared with you, and you have to sort of I get roasted, screamed at, and as a council member, and I know it's not about me. I mean, maybe it is, maybe it's not, but I know that as challenging it is that I'm hearing this from someone, they are experiencing it, so it's my job to listen, to sit with that, think about, all right, what is the need and how do I locate the resource? And whether this person thanks me, whether they hate me, whether they want to keep complaining, it doesn't, whether they voted for me or not, none of that matters, because I made a promise to everyone. And if I did not have the skill set that I developed with You Speaks, with the spoken word community, through all of our, because you and I, we had some difficult moments throughout our friendship, and just through as colleagues, and just as a community over time, going through all the things everyone was going through. And we had to decide whether or not we were committed to each other, and whether we were committed to the space. And looking back at being on teams and coaching teams, we work really hard to create that groundwork for people, so when they're up there and they're sharing these deep truths, they don't feel alone. They don't feel like they're being put on the spot. They don't feel like they're just being told to do that because they think that this will score well. And we go up there and we say, okay, if you look at us, make eye contact, stay anchored with us, we're going to be here when you get back, when you come down, and we're going to hold you, and that as leaders, we have to do that for our community, whether it's a district, whether it's a citywide, whether it's a special district.
I love that.
Because the seat I sit in is not my seat. It doesn't belong to me. It belongs to all of them, and so long as I'm here, I want them to know that. I want them to use that, and I want them to use their voice, and I'll amplify that, and I'll use my voice as their voice,
I feel like that is one of the strongest and the most kind of urgent needs right now in this moment, not just for young people, certainly for me in my generation. I'm late 30s, early 40s, like the tail end of what's still considered the millennial generation. And, you were talking about, you like, look, I was going through some, before I decided to run for city council, I was going through a lot professionally, academically, but also personally. And it all kind of came to a head. And in this moment, and kind of globally in the moment, it was like the global uprisings around the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor. And it was the moment when we saw lots of corporations across the country wanting to take some really did did their best effort to kind of make a step forward and operationalize belonging and inclusion, whether it's in their workplace or in their communities. But I think that what you're talking to might be, at least from my perspective, one of the most critical and urgent skills that we can all benefit from, which is like, how do you actually sit and listen, not just to the people who agree with you and that you agree with, but how do we sit and listen and commit to serving a larger shared goal of creating a better future? Like, when you want to, like, when you're being yelled at, when you when you just fundamentally feel like you don't agree with the perspective that's coming out from this person's mouth, to me, I feel like arts and culture and storytelling might be one of the most effective ways to learn that skill. I don't know if you have thoughts on that, but
absolutely. I mean, when you're in the getting yelled at, sometimes you just have to like watch the clock run down and just like, okay, but with the arts, it's like there are ways where you can dislodge someone from their assumptions, their expectations in a way that allows for them to, learn something new or be more open to something they didn't expect. And and the arts can do that in a number of ways. I mean, I'm always going to go back to poetry, but like for me, whenever I read something that's like weird or surprising,
yeah,
I'm like, okay, like what, it catches me off guard. And then I start to think more. And then I'm like, oh, okay. And I become more engaged, right? That's one way. I think a lot about the different ways we learn. Like in my area, my district, there's a lot of like life science. There's a lot of like STEAM, and that kind of thing. I think about how, well, using my own example, I became very enamored of like science poetry and like, like, like by a lot, like
not surprised
processes and and like just the language of it, the way that things, the mechanics and processes of organisms, and how that is a kind of poetry. And through my love of poetry, I actually was able to like kind of learn a little bit about the stuff, and that's a really powerful tool.
Yes.
And we try to support a lot of those programs. When I was on the Children, Youth, and Recreation Commission, I was in the grants committee. And then when I was on the Civic Arts Commission, I was on the grants committee. So I think about how do we seek out those programs, those teaching artists who are doing that kind of work that allows us to fulfill a critical need in the community, and how do we mobilize resources to support and sustain that work?
I love that, because one of the first visual, writers, we use metaphor all the time. And it wasn't until I started taking the metaphors off of the page and into the world and in conversations that I realized there's a whole new way to understand the power and role of the poet or the artist in civic life, in life in general. So the mitochondria is like the energizing bunny of the cell, and we're all made of cells. And at one point, it lived outside of the organism, outside of the cell. And over time, evolutionary, it became critical and core to making a cell like function and fuel, which we're all made of. So it's like this core engine that keeps us alive and keeps life moving forward. But it also comes from the mother. So your mitochondria, Terry, is from your mom, mine is from my mom. I use this metaphor a lot when people are like, well, what's the value of the poet, Mush? Like, y'all, poetry, and I'm being really, really harsh, but sometimes people will say, oh, that's cute. Poetry belongs at the beginning of a big conference for entertainment value only. Now, not always. There are lots of partners who understand like the value is beyond the 5-minute entertainment part of the agenda or the program. So, but I know that, we're often kind of misperceived and put in a box like, oh, that's the poetry thing. That's the, and so I wonder, like, in Berkeley, how do you see cultural activists, either in your district and District 2 or across the city? How do you see artists and poets and cultural leaders in Berkeley kind of pushing up into new sectors? Like, oh, wait, what is a visual artist doing here? Or what is a poet doing here? Or what is a sculptor doing in this conversation about city planning or bids? Or I know that the city of Berkeley has a cultural strategies and government program, but I'm wondering what you're also seeing, like the way that Berkeley artists are showing up and lending their voice in conversations where people might think they don't belong or we don't belong.
Certainly. I think in Berkeley and in my district in particular, there's a big question about the role of the artist in land use.
Right? Say more.
So my district, we have mixed manufacturing, which is like, we have one big company, it's Bayer. They do like, they make pharma stuff, they do medicine, they make medicine. We also have mixed use light industrial, so that's everything from warehouses to like forges. We have like the arts foundry, and we have, glass makers, and like we even have like a harpsichord maker. All these kinds of makers, people who are, making things out of materials. And we also have like media arts, right? And there are all these questions now about land use because these are the only like zones of this type in the city. And there are all these, economic pressures on what to do with the spaces. Should it be housing instead? Should it be offices? Should it just be this or that? But, folks in my area have fought so hard to create that ecology. And so I think, okay, now it's time for us to fight again to really recodify and rearticulate that vision that we've held on to all these years as we move forward and the city continues to grow. How do we lock in and keep, those harpsichord makers, right? And these folks have to be at the table because that kind of thinking, that's not the same thing as a planner. Nothing against them being like, oh well, let's just like move this over here, but it's like, I spend a lot of time visiting, these folks, getting to know what they do, how they've come up against this kind of thing. So I'm creating like a working group because I'm working on like kind of a West Berkeley Green New Deal to like guide vision for land use, especially around manufacturing and art and arts, the arts economy in West Berkeley. And I want to have these folks at the table, and so we can all think through it together. So I think that the artists now, Plato writes, Plato writes in the.
Okay, y'all heard it first. We're going into Plato now. The real conversation has started.
Everyone talks about, Plato saying, oh, poets should be driven from the city. And I wrestled with that question, that tension through my program. You also have, Auden being like, oh, poetry makes something happen. And then I'm going to be like, well, no, I'm going to challenge both those ideas. I'm going to show you what poetry makes happen and what happens when poets are in the city, and that's the same for dancers and musicians and video producers. Like, we have to be the ones shaping the city. You can't just be, retired gentle persons and business people. It needs to be folks who are, out there struggling to hold on to space, making things, and making things in the communities where they are, right?
I think, not to cut you off, Terry, but I think that is one of the most interesting areas to look towards when we're thinking about artists, poets, and cultural creators, like those who are working and have found like their community of people who are cross-sectoral or people who are coming from different walks of life, whether it's law, public policy, or business, or technology, or the healthcare industry, city planning, development, all like the most interesting kind of work that I'm seeing out in the world, but certainly here in the Bay, are artists who have found their kind of their system. It's like a creative system of architects that are kind of remaking small, like sometimes it's just a block at a time, like small, like the Black Culture Zone in here in Oakland, or Good Eats and Civic Design in Oakland, really kind of thinking about how do we engage architects, city planners, electeds, real estate developers, and artists and young people to come together at the table at the start of an idea for how to create and place keep equitably. And I think that's just something that I want to name and point out, because this work is happening. It's not like we need to really we do need to make a case and uplift these stories, but that's, to me, across the country, but here in Oakland and Berkeley and Seattle too, some of the most interesting work that I see young artists and cultural leaders kind of pushing into. And I think that's amazing. Okay, so we have all of 7 minutes left, and I can't end with this without asking you this question. So are we ready?
We are.
Okay, good. I needed the call and response, right, Terry? For Youth Speaks, remember? Okay, so you and I coached the Brave New Voices team, right, in New York. Was that us?
I was on the team. You were coaching.
Oh, was I coaching? In my mind, you were actually a co-coach, but you were on the team. Okay, so
I think we did that was that Chicago? No, it was.
It was New York, wasn't it? It was.
Did we go back to New York?
I thought we were. We might have been. Oh, maybe it was Chicago.
It might have been Chicago.
Okay, see, y'all, Terry and I go back like at least 15 years, right? If not longer.
Yeah.
Okay. So when I first met you, I was like, what is this poetry? We're talking about Greek lore, biblical names that I had never heard of. And I know this about you, so I'm going to ask you a fun question. We're going to move a little bit into this. So I know, since you were a young person, like a teenager, you draw a lot of inspiration from fantasy and fiction. Can you tell us one of the most important lessons you've learned from reading and in stories and getting lost in stories like Lord of the Rings, Game of Thrones, X-Men, and Greek mythology? Any of those? I know you're into all of that.
Or I'm gonna try to hit all those. I know we only have 2 minutes. I mean, it's all about like power and community. With Lord of the Rings, thinking about there's the One Ring, the Ring of Sauron, the Ring that rules them all.
Wait, what? There's more than one ring?
There's like 10 rings.
What?
I don't know if it's 10. It's more than 10. I'm not. Yeah, it's like there's 3 rings and there's like more. There's more rings. There's just rings.
There's lots of rings in Lord of the Ring. Right, it's plural.
Okay. It's like Lord of all the rings.
Okay, got it.
But there's the idea of the One Ring, the Ring of Sauron that rules them all. That is also the corrosive influence upon Middle Earth. But there's also the 3 Elven rings, which were made without Sauron's influence, and these are the rings that belong to Gandalf, Galadriel, and Elrond. And each of these 3 rings, what they do is they give the holder the power to like inspire, protect, or heal others. Ooh. So these rings are used. So in this scenario, power is kept for the service of the community, versus the Sauron ring, which is power is kept to bend everything to the self. And that is,
oh my God.
In Game of Thrones, power is about relation and positionality. I rule this part of the kingdom. These are my troops. These are my resources. These are my weaknesses. Huh. The alliances are what create the ability to leverage power across the kingdom. It's about also, so I represent, a historically Black and brown district, disinvestment with a lot of like gentrification also, and a high tax base from from the commercials. So it's like I had to think about like, how am I leveraging my relationship with other council members? How am I, what resources am I aware that I'm bringing to the table, and what do I know that I need, right? And where do I hold the line? Where do I strike? And who do I rock with? Because we have to do that not just for our jobs, but for the folks at home who look like us, who won't see themselves up here, who will never know what we're doing, but who are going to be always impacted the first and the hardest. And the X-Men, power coming from who you are, but also who you are being a threat to the status quo.
Wait. Say that part twice, please. What?
Power coming from being who you are, but also who you are being a threat to the status quo. Being marginalized, but still, getting up in the face of prejudice and discrimination and fighting it, like getting on the front lines and actually fighting it, and learning how to, stand in your power, and how to not, be destroyed by that as well. How to heal, and how to confront anger and deal with that, and how to use that, and also, especially with X-Men, being, not just showing up for yourself, but showing up for your crew, your homies, your community. And when you see someone falling, you pick them up, and when you're breaking down, you ask for help.
That was amazing, Terry. I've never heard you talk about all three of those, books, movies, epic trilogy, historical fan fiction novel. All of that.
All the above.
That was amazing. Okay, we're gonna end this conversation, but I want to ask you this. Okay. We're gonna do rapid fire. A couple of questions, and just whatever the first thing that comes to your mind. Yeah. If you had to describe You Speaks in one sentence, what would it be?
The fields through which we learn how to not struggle together, but persist with one another.
Service looks like
fighting with everything you have, even for one person, just to get to their doctor's appointment on time without anyone ever knowing it, and maybe even everyone hating you for it.
My cultural or literary hero, dead or alive, is?
It's a lot of pressure. Right now, I would just have to say myself.
Let's go, Terry Taplin. One of the things that I learned at You Speaks was that you for every 5 people that are watching, you tell your story, get up and speak your truth, even if your voice shakes. Shout out Audre Lorde. That there, behind those 5 people, there are 500 people that we never realize are watching us and taking note, because they've never seen that blueprint for themselves. So shout out Terry Taplin. Love is?
Love is the first and the last. Everything is
Alpha Omega. Okay. I love it. And where will you be in 5 years?
In 5 years, I will be in Miami on the beach, and I will be loving it.
Last question. What brings you hope?
What brings me hope? That's tough, because I feel like hope is a choice. And I wake up every day and I decide that, you know what, it's worth it. It's worth it for my nieces. It's worth it for everyone else. It's worth, staying in this seat, staying in the fight, and always pushing for more ways that I can serve the greatest amount of people. I really believe in that. I believe service is everything. I believe in the greater good. And so long as I'm able and have the resources, and, so long as, I am able to do this, I'm going to, because I feel like somewhere, I feel like a lot of people across time have done this for me, my ancestors, I feel like this is like the least I can do,
And I would reflect back, Terry, that as you think this is the least you can do, this is probably like just your existence and your voice and the way that you show up in spaces to drive justice, to kind of your ethos as a public servant is probably I know that is kind of the greatest kind of model for somebody out there, many people, young people out there who might not be able to see themselves in seats like you're in. So I want to thank you, Councilmember Terry Taplin of District 2 of the great city of Berkeley, California. Where can folks go to find more information about your campaign, your platforms, and how to support Southwest Berkeley?
Thank you so much. Folks can go to my website, terrytaplin.com, like that's just my name. You can, see what I'm doing, what I'm up to, what I stand for, my projects, my policies, all that. Also, Twitter at Taplin Terry, last name, first name. There, I'm always, blabbering over there. So those are the two best places. You can find me on Instagram at Kelp Gardens. That's for me as a person, which is still me as a council member. That's for more when I'm more my fun stuff, and then my council stuff is Councilmember_Taplin on Instagram. That's for my very important but sometimes less fun council work.
So there you have it. That's where you can tune in and tap into the great work that Councilmember Taplin is doing in District 2 over in Berkeley, California. Thanks, y'all, for tuning in. Terry, I want to thank you so much for agreeing to have this conversation, and also just some of the great reflections that even I hadn't heard of the power of poetry in your life. And of course, You Speaks, it was such an integral part to both of us as young people, as me as a young adult, and you as a young student. And so it's crazy to be here 15, 16, 17 years later. You as a council person, me now running the organization that gave us so much, and that we in turn, I think I can say that we gave a lot too. So thank you.
Thank you. So happy to be here.
Thank you all for tuning in to Poetry and Politics. Again, that was Terry Taplin of the city of Berkeley. And thank you for being here. Before we leave, I want to give everybody a chance to support Youth Speaks in our 25th anniversary campaign. April is National Poetry Month. So if you're out there, if you enjoyed the conversation, please hit us up. In a few moments, you're going to see an opportunity for how you can support us this month. We have about 2 weeks left. To raise in the next 2 weeks. We are halfway there. So if you are out there, you support Terry, support young people and the celebration of their voices, please check us out. You can text to the number on the screen, or you can also use the QR code. Thank you all. You Speaks, because the next generation is speaking for itself.